Have you ever been somewhere so quiet you could hear the blood pumping in your ears? A quiet so deep it feels loud? That's the sound of the high desert. It's a place of immense, lonely beauty. And it was in that profound silence back in the late 1940s that a man from the hills of West Virginia prepared to make the loudest noise in history. We all think we know the story. A handsome pilot, a daredevil with nerves of steel, straps himself into a tiny orange bullet-shaped rocket plane. He blasts through the sky, breaks an invisible wall, and becomes a legend overnight. It's a clean story, a perfect American myth. But like all myths, the real story, the human story, is a lot messier. It's a story not just of courage, but of quiet desperation, of pain, of secrets, and of a love that was the real fuel in the tank. This isn't just the story of the man who broke the sound barrier. It's the story of what it cost him, what it meant, and why, long after the sonic boom faded, his life still echoes. To understand Chuck Yeager, you have to understand the world that forged him. He was born in 1923, not into a world of gleaming rocket ships, but into the rugged, unforgiving hills of West Virginia. This was Appalachian country, a place where life was etched into the coal-dusted valleys and timber-stripped mountains. It was a world of self-reliance where you learned to hunt and fish not for sport, but for supper, where you learned to fix an engine because there was no one else to do it for you. There was no silver spoon, no paved path to glory. There was just hard work, a close-knit family, and the quiet expectation that a man takes care of his own. This upbringing didn't just give him a distinctive drawl, it instilled in him a profound, almost primal, mechanical intuition. Yeager understood machinery not from textbooks, but with his hands. He could feel the rhythm of an engine, sense its weaknesses, its limits. It was a language he spoke more fluently than any other. When the Second World War ripped across the globe, it was this practical genius, this raw, untutored talent that the United States Army Air Forces were desperately seeking. Yeager wasn't an officer, not a college boy. He enlisted as a private, a simple aircraft mechanic. For him, the cockpit wasn't a birthright. It was a place he had to fight his way into, proving with his hands and his wits that he belonged there, among the clouds. This was the foundation of the man, not an educated patrician, but a working-class survivor who saw a complex machine not as a threat, but as a puzzle he was born to solve. The European theater of World War II was a brutal, unforgiving crucible. For a fighter pilot, the life expectancy could be measured in weeks. It was here that the young mechanic from West Virginia truly came into his own. Flying the legendary P-51 Mustang, Yeager wasn't just a good pilot. He was a natural. He had what the old flyers called the knack. He saw the sky in 3 dimensions, processing angles and speeds with an almost supernatural calm. He quickly became an ace with 5 confirmed kills, but his war was nearly cut short. On his 8th mission over occupied France, he was shot down. He bailed out, his plane a flaming wreck, and found himself a lone American airman deep in enemy territory. This is where the story often gets condensed, a mere footnote. But what happened on the ground was as formative as anything he did in the air. Aided by the French resistance, the Maquis, Yeager undertook a grueling trek, hiding in barns, trekking through forests, and eventually making a harrowing journey over the snow-capped Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain. He saw the grim reality of war up close, the courage of ordinary people, the constant gnawing fear. He even helped another downed airman, a man with a severe leg wound, carrying him over the most difficult parts of the mountain pass. He learned about explosives from the resistance fighters, skills he'd later, somewhat alarmingly, use for crafting homemade bombs for fun back home. When he finally made it back to England, the military had a strict policy. Any evader who had been helped by the resistance couldn't fly over enemy territory again. The risk of being shot down a second time and captured was too great. Under torture, he could reveal the names and locations of the brave French citizens who had saved him. For Yeager, this was a fate worse than death. Being grounded felt like a betrayal of his very being. He wasn't having it. In a move that would define his entire career, he fought the system. He and another grounded pilot went up the chain of command, arguing their case with a stubborn, almost infuriating persistence. Finally, they got an audience with the Supreme Allied Commander himself, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike, impressed by their sheer grit and determination, overturned the policy. Yeager went back into the fight with a vengeance. On one incredible day in October 1944, he took down 5 enemy fighters in a single mission, becoming an ace in a day. One of his most famous victories came without firing a single shot. He maneuvered his P-51 so perfectly on the tail of a German Messerschmitt that the panicked enemy pilot snapped his own plane into a stall and bailed out. Yeager had, in essence, scared him out of the sky. This was the man who returned from the war, not just a hero, but a man who had looked death in the face, been grounded, and had clawed his way back into the sky through sheer, unadulterated willpower. He had learned a vital lesson. Rules were for people who followed them. For him, they were merely obstacles to be overcome. After the war, the new frontier wasn't in Europe or the Pacific. The victorious powers entered a new, colder kind of conflict, one fought not with armies, but with technology. And the bleeding edge of that technology was at a remote, sun-scorched patch of desert in California called Muroc. It was a place that pilots joked was at the end of the world. It was stark, isolated, and utterly unforgiving. If your engine failed over Muroc, you had the largest, flattest emergency landing strip in the world, the giant dry lake bed. It was the perfect place to fly dangerous experimental aircraft and to bury your mistakes. This is where the military sent its best and brightest pilots. Not necessarily the most polished, but the ones with the best hands, the sharpest instincts. They were test pilots, a new kind of fraternity whose job was to take brand new, often deeply flawed aircraft and push them to their breaking points and hopefully live to write a report about it. The pay was low, the living conditions were basic, and the risk was astronomical. In 1 year alone, Muroc saw over 60 major accidents. Pilots joked they got $1 a day and a hole in the ground. It was into this high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled world that Captain Chuck Yeager arrived. He wasn't the most experienced test pilot, nor the most educated. Many of his peers were engineers, men who understood the complex physics of flight through equations and wind tunnel data. Yeager, true to form, understood it through the seat of his pants. He had an uncanny ability to fly an airplane to the ragged edge of its performance envelope and tell the engineers not just what happened, but why it happened, in a language they could use to fix it. He was a bridge between the men who flew the planes and the men who designed them. And at Muroc, there was one great, terrifying prize, one invisible monster that had already killed several brilliant pilots, including Britain's Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. They called it the sound barrier. As aircraft approached the speed of sound, roughly 760 miles per hour at sea level, strange and violent things began to happen. The controls would freeze or reverse. The aircraft would be seized by violent, uncontrollable shaking, a phenomenon they called buffeting. It was as if the air itself turned to brick. Many believed it was an absolute limit, a wall that could not be breached. The program to do just that was top secret designated the XS-1 for Experimental Sonic 1. The little aircraft, painted a brilliant orange so it could be easily spotted against the blue desert sky, wasn't a plane in the traditional sense. It was a rocket with wings. It couldn't take off on its own. It had to be hauled into the sky by a B-29 bomber and dropped like a bomb. The mission was so dangerous that the contractor, Bell Aircraft, wanted a civilian pilot to fly it for the staggering sum of $150,000. But the newly formed U.S. Air Force insisted one of their own would take the risk. They offered it to their best. They offered it to Chuck Yeager for his standard captain's salary of a few $100s a month. But behind the steely-eyed test pilot was a man deeply in love. He had met Glynis Dickhouse at a USO dance before he left for the war. He was, by his own admission, awkward and shy. She was beautiful and vivacious. He pursued her with the same single-minded focus he would later apply to the sound barrier. They were married as soon as he returned from Europe. Glynis was the anchor in his turbulent world. She understood the risks, even if he never spelled them out. The wives at Muroc lived with a unique kind of dread. Every time a plane went up, they listened for the sonic boom that signaled a safe return. Its absence was a silence that screamed. Late on a Saturday night, after a few drinks at Poncho Barnes's infamous Happy Bottom Riding Club, the raucous desert saloon where pilots blew off steam, Chuck and Glynis went for a horseback ride in the dark. In a moment of recklessness, they raced. A gate was closed that shouldn't have been. Yeager's horse shied, and he was thrown, tumbling hard in the dark. The pain was immediate and sharp. He had broken 2 ribs. This should have been the end of it. A pilot with broken ribs couldn't possibly fly a high-G, physically demanding mission in a cramped cockpit. Reporting the injury would mean scrubbing the flight, handing the glory to his backup pilot, Bob Hoover. The thought was unbearable to Yeager, not just because of the glory, but because he believed he was the only one who could do it. He had a feel for the glamorous Glynis, as he'd named the X1 after his wife. He knew its secrets. So he entered into a conspiracy of silence. He drove off base to a civilian veterinarian in the nearby town of Rosamond, who taped him up discreetly. He told no one except Glynis and his close friend, and the project's engineer, Jack Ridley. The problem wasn't just the pain. The real issue was the X1's hatch. To seal it from the inside required him to reach across his body with his right arm and push a heavy lever, a movement that was now impossible with his broken ribs. The mission was doomed. It was Ridley, the brilliant, quiet engineer, who saved the day. That morning, in the pre-dawn darkness of the hangar, Ridley slipped Yeager a 10-inch length of broomstick handle he had sawed off. It was a simple, elegant, West Virginia-style solution. Yeager could use the stick with his left hand to give himself the leverage he needed to lock the hatch. This one small secret act of ingenuity, born of desperation and friendship, is what truly enabled history to be made. On the morning of October 14th, Yeager was in agony, but his face was a mask of cool professionalism. He was bundled into his flight suit, his taped ribs screaming with every breath. He climbed aboard the B-29 mothership, the small piece of broomstick hidden in his suit. Once airborne, he squeezed through the tight bomb bay and lowered himself into the tiny freezing cockpit of the glamorous Glynis. The hatch was locked, using the secret lever. He was alone, cradled in a bomb bay, breathing pure oxygen, waiting for the drop. At 20,000 feet, the countdown began. 3, 2, 1, drop. For a moment, there was a terrifying silence as the X-1 fell away from the B-29. Then Yeager ignited the 4 chambers of his rocket engine, and a monster kicked him in the back. The acceleration was brutal, pinning him to his seat. He was a passenger on a roaring, vibrating spear, pointing at the heavens. He climbed faster than any man had ever flown. As he approached Mach 0.94, the speed of sound at that altitude, the familiar, dreaded buffeting began. The wings shook, the controls went slack. This was the demon on the doorstep, the point where other planes had been torn apart. But Yeager and the engineers had a theory. They believed the buffeting was caused by shock waves forming on the wings and tail, disrupting the airflow. The solution, they hoped, was a new innovative feature of the X-1, an all-moving horizontal tailplane. Instead of just a hinged elevator at the back of the tail, the entire tail surface could be adjusted for trim. In that critical moment, with the plane shaking violently, Yeager calmly flicked the switch to adjust the tail trim. The Mach meter in his cockpit was notoriously unreliable at that speed, but the needle flickered, then jumped off the scale. Up in the B-29, the flight team listened. On the ground, seismographs registered nothing. All was quiet. And then, for the first time in human history, a sound created by a man in the sky reached the ground. On the radio, Yeager's voice, impossibly characteristically calm, crackled through. "Hey, Ridley," he said, "that machine is acting screwy. It just went off the scale." Then a few moments later, "I'm still going upstairs like a bat out of hell." He had done it. He was flying faster than the speed of sound. He was, as he would later write, a poke-through. There was no wall. There was just a bump in the road. After his fuel was exhausted, he glided the glamorous Glennis down, a sleek orange bird with no power, and landed it perfectly on the dry lake bed, just as he had done so many times before. The man who climbed out of the cockpit was the same man who had climbed in, but the world would never be the same. The story of the sound barrier was top secret. For months, Yeager and his team went about their work as if nothing had happened. But secrets like that don't keep. When the news finally broke in December 1947, Chuck Yeager was transformed overnight from an obscure test pilot into an international icon. He was the man who had the right stuff, a phrase Tom Wolfe would later coin, to describe that almost mystical combination of skill, courage, and grace under pressure. He was the embodiment of a new technologically powerful America. But this is where the clean myth and the complicated man begin to diverge. Yeager was not comfortable with fame. He was a pilot, not a celebrity. He was direct, gruff, and had little patience for the niceties of public relations. He found the endless questions from reporters, the handshaking with politicians, to be a tedious distraction from his real work, flying airplanes. This created a tension that would run through the rest of his life. He was a public hero who craved the private, focused world of the cockpit and the hangar. And this attitude brought him into conflict with the changing nature of aerospace. When NASA was formed to put a man into space, they weren't looking for pilots in the Yeager mold. They wanted college-educated engineers and scientists who could be, in his own derisive words, spam in a can. They wanted passengers for a fully automated capsule, not pilots who would fly their craft. Yeager was famously and vocally critical of the Mercury 7 astronauts. He didn't believe they were the best pilots. He believed they were the best test subjects. There was a bitter irony in this. The man who had opened the door to the wild blue yonder found himself on the outside looking in as the nation turned its gaze from the sky to the stars. He believed the future was in winged vehicles like the X-15 rocket plane, which pilots could actually fly, not in capsules shot from a cannon. History would eventually prove him right with the development of the space shuttle, but at the time, his outspoken criticism was seen by some as sour grapes. It was the blunt, unvarnished opinion of a man who refused to play the political game, and it probably cost him a chance to walk on the moon. In the early 1960s, he was the commandant of the USAF Aerospace Research Pilot School, training the next generation of test pilots, many of whom would become astronauts. He was now Colonel Yeager, a living legend in his 40s, but he refused to be a desk jockey. He still flew the hottest planes, and the hottest plane of all was the Lockheed NF-104A, a modified fighter jet with a rocket engine strapped to its tail, designed to zoom climb to the very edge of space. It was a beast of an airplane, known by pilots as the missile with a man in it. On December 10, 1963, Yeager took one up for a record altitude attempt. He was pushing the envelope just as he always had. He soared past 100,000 feet into the thin black air where the sky meets space. He was in a pressure suit, essentially a personal spacecraft. But as he began his descent, things went catastrophically wrong. The aircraft's nose pitched up uncontrollably. He was in a flat spin, falling like a leaf from 104,000 feet. The controls were useless for over 90,000 feet for an eternity of 13 full rotations. The world's most famous pilot fought a machine he could not control. He did everything he knew, drawing on a lifetime of experience, but the plane was a dead thing, plummeting towards the desert floor. But the ejection itself was a nightmare. The violent force slammed him into his seat, and the rocket motor of the ejection seat, full of still-burning propellant, became a blowtorch. It ignited the pure oxygen atmosphere inside his helmet, turning it into an inferno. His faceplate melted. He was engulfed in flames, his lungs seared by fire. He was falling, tangled in his parachute lines, his face a mass of molten plastic and burned flesh. In a moment of pure animal instinct and incredible presence of mind, he realized he had to open his helmet to breathe, even though the air was filled with burning debris. He managed to get a glove inside his shattered visor and pry it open, gasping for air as the flames finally subsided. He landed hard in the desert, seriously injured, his face and hands severely burned. His life reminds us that progress is never clean. It's built on risk, on secrets, on quiet acts of courage and cleverness, like a piece of a broom handle. It's pushed forward by people who are often difficult, stubborn, and unwilling to accept the word impossible. Yeager wasn't a saint. He could be abrasive, arrogant, and held firm opinions that often ruffled feathers. He was a product of his time with all its glories and its flaws. But his integrity to his core mission, to fly the airplane, tell the truth about it, and come back to do it again the next day, was absolute. His story is also a profound love story. Glennis was his co-pilot on the ground for nearly 45 years. She raised their children, often alone, under the constant shadow of potential tragedy. She endured the fame and the long absences. When she passed away in 1990, a part of the legend died with her. He was the glamorous Glennis' namesake, but she was his rock, the silent, steady force that allowed him to dance on the edge of the abyss. Chuck Yeager was a hero, yes, but he was also just a man from West Virginia who was very, very good at his job. And in his story, we see that sometimes that is more than enough to change the world. The boom may have faded, but the echo of that courage, that grit, that sheer stubborn will, that is a sound that will never disappear. And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. Appreciate you watching.